Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. And so now we're at our last lecture on the Hopis. Of course, I have to tell you what I left out from last week. So last week I told you about the story of Quanah Parker and how his mother was a kidnapped white woman, Cynthia, who was kidnapped at about 9 years of age. And then she grew up and became the wife of a chief, and she had 3 children, one of whom was Quanah Parker. Now, that story became very famous because when she was recaptured, she never did adjust back to life among white people, which is a very tragic thing that twice she was traumatized by being captured that way. So that was such a famous story that it inspired a Western movie. How many of you know what movie was made from that incident? Nobody?
The Searchers?
The Searchers. John Wayne. Some people say that's his best movie, is The Searchers. And of course, the catch, the thing that's supposed to really grab your attention, I'm going to ruin the movie for you here, was that John Wayne and another guy are searching for this girl that was captured. It's Natalie Wood plays this part as a grown-up. But a young girl is captured. And for years, John Wayne and this other character are looking for her. And when they finally find her, many years later, she has grown up. And what the shocker of this movie is that the reason John Wayne, there we go. The reason John Wayne was searching all of these years to find her is to kill her. Because he knew, and everybody knew, what happens to girls when they are kidnapped by the Indians. They are raped. And that, in those days, everyone would say, everybody knew what that meant. That is the fate worse than death. And that's what everybody in their minds knew. If you were gang raped, and if you were a young girl, you would be. Actually, any girl would. Grown women also. And so it was known amongst people back in those days, that is the fate worse than death. And so in this movie, John Wayne is out to kill her because she has experienced the fate worse than death, becoming one of them and becoming a wife of some Indian. Now, it's interesting, though, that the movies actually make, in this instance, the main guy of the movie, John Wayne, they make him out to be worse than the real story. The guy who was actually looking for his family, it was the uncle of Cynthia, he was not like that at all. He actually did find some of his relatives. He never did find Cynthia. She was recaptured 24 years later. But he was not like that. And actually, there is no story that I know of people going out to search for their relatives who have been captured and looking to kill them because they've already been ruined. So this is a case in which the Hollywood movie makes the racism of white people even worse than it already was. So, hope I didn't ruin the movie for you.
Did he succeed?
So, near the end of the movie, he's about to shoot her. He sees her off in the distance, and he's about to shoot her. But the guy that he's with never realized through these whole years that that's what he intended to do. So he stops John Wayne from killing her, and then they have this big fight amongst each other. And then they actually do get her later, and John Wayne changes his mind. He has a change of heart. No, I'm not going to kill her. I'm going to rescue her. And so, okay, so the Hopi Indians. I have for a long time wanted to learn something of the Hopi, because I remember back in college learning bits and pieces, just hearing things about them, that they were something of a pacifist tribe, that they had a way of life that was something akin to, we would say, like the Mennonites, or some religious group that were pacifists. And so this is my opportunity to find out about that. That's why I chose them. So I actually had a very difficult time finding the right books that I was looking for. If you look online, you look in bookstores, you will see books on the Hopi Indians. You'll find books about their art, the Kachina dolls, which they're most famous for, their prophecies, and their way of life. You will not find much on their history, and that's what I was looking for. So this was something rather frustrating for me, because I never did find a very good, comprehensive history of the Hopi. So this right here, by the way, is really the only book that I got that was truly enjoyable to read for me. And this is just my taste. I mean, others might see it differently. But we'll be talking about, this is the guy that we'll be talking about more personally. So, this first one, this is a history of the Hopi, but it's for like middle school kids. This is a series. It's actually a nice series. They've some like 35 volumes of this on various Native American tribes, and it's a very good introduction to each of those tribes. But for my purposes, that's really all it is an introduction. There's nothing really in depth. It's something, like I said, made for middle school kids. This next one, I really thought would be a really interesting read. This is about a guy who went to live with them in the 1800s, spent several years. He was a doctor who worked with them and for them during that time. And I thought, wow, this should be a really good read. For me, it was not. This was not his writings so much as somebody writing about him, and other essays in this book. I really didn't find much at all that was very interesting about this, and I was kind of really disappointed. This next one, Frank Waters' Book of the Hopi. This is a book that is mostly about the legends that they have, the myths of the Hopi, and maybe 100 pages or so of it is their history. So this is about as in-depth as I could get as far as their history goes. There wasn't, like I said, I just could not find a comprehensive history of the Hopi. So I hope it doesn't show too badly here. This next one, again, another, for me, a bit of a disappointment. Leo Crane, Indians of the Enchanted Desert. This was a guy working with the Indian Department that worked with them. Worked with them in the 19-teens and thereabout for several years. And this guy, for some people, I think you would really enjoy this style of writing. I did not at all. This guy writes like he was writing for National Geographic. If you really like reading National Geographic articles, you might like this guy. I don't really care for National Geographic articles because they meander too much for me. And it's very wordy, and he says in 10 pages what he could really say in 1 page. So again, this is just me. There is some interest in it. he's a very intelligent guy, and like I said, for some people I have no doubt that you would thoroughly enjoy his style of writing. I just didn't myself. And this last one, the one book that I thoroughly enjoyed, the Sun Chief, and that's the picture of the guy beginning, Dawn Taliyasva. This is a truly interesting read. It's his autobiography, and he was born in 1890, and so the Hopi tribe had not changed too much at that point, so that he had a pretty authentic childhood on the Hopi reservations. So, and he gets very, very personal, much more so than you'd see in just about any other autobiography, and I'll explain in a little while. So the Hopi, they probably are among the earliest of inhabitants of especially the Southwest. They were related distantly to the Aztecs and a number of other tribes, the Utes, and they came to Arizona, the area at least, somewhere a few thousand years ago. They started agriculture and expanded from there. And one of their towns is now known, if I say this right, I'm not doing this well. Oribe, thank you. Oribe is known as the town that's been settled continuously for longer than any other village or town in the United States. So sometime in the 1100s, they settled there and have been there ever since. So, they ate corn like many tribes across the country. How many of you have ever been to Arizona? Oh, very good. So you know that it is a desert throughout Arizona. There are rivers that run through it. The annual rainfall in the area is somewhere around 10 inches, which isn't much. And they are not irrigating their fields. This is dry farming for them. So they rely almost entirely on their corn crops for the rain. So if the rain comes at the wrong time, if there isn't enough of it, they may starve. And that kind of thing happened many times throughout their history. Their hold on food and on life is somewhat tenuous out there. But of course they had beans, they had squash, and later on they got other crops from the Spanish. But they had wild food as well. The piñon nuts, juniper berries, prickly pears, mesquite beans, and there's actually a wild spinach that grows out there. Something that I never would have thought possible, but in their particular area, they have some springs. There's no major river that runs through there, but they do have springs which they relied on for water to drink. And of course, they were hunters as well. They could hunt rabbits and other rodents. There's bears out there. There's deer, antelope, and a few other animals. And oddly enough, there are turkeys out there, but they would not eat turkeys or any other bird except for doves. Why that is, I do not know. They did use turkeys for their feathers. They enjoyed using them for ceremonial purposes, but for some reason they would not eat turkeys. And of course, they would have hawks and eagles that they would keep also, but that would certainly not be something that they would eat as being sacred animals. They also had dogs. They would only eat those in dire straits, though. So here's the Hopi agriculture, they're growing their corn. Now this is a particular strain of corn, not something that you would see in your supermarkets. This is a very hearty corn that does not need a lot of water, apparently, and probably doesn't grow very tall, but it's enough. And this is what sustained them mainly, their primary staple crop. So, as in most Native American tribes, you have your gender roles, particular jobs that men would do and particular jobs that women would do. So men would do the hunting, the farming, the herding, the trading. They would do the religious ceremonies. They were pretty much entirely the political leadership of the tribe. But they would also card and spin wool. Once they got sheep from the Spanish anyway. It was the men's job, not the women, to spin the wool and cotton when they got that. They would weave blankets, make moccasins, and of course make tools and build the houses. The women would do the cooking. They would take care of the household, raise the children, and they would have gardens that they would tend also, and they would go fetch the water. Now, more than most tribes that I've read about, there's actually an interaction or trade-off with the labor, that both could do many of the jobs, not all of them. But when it came to things like building houses, oftentimes the women may help out in that. Making the clothes, as I've said, is oddly enough a man's job here, but women could do that as well. Gathering firewood, which is very important because it does snow in the wintertime in Arizona in the higher elevations. So gathering firewood was an important job. Both men and women could do that. Oftentimes the children would do that. So there was not, as in many tribes, there was not a sharp division that only men could do this and only women are supposed to do that. It blended a lot more than most.
What does card wool mean?
Who can tell me what carding wool is?
It's where you take the comb and go through the wool to straighten the fibers so you can spin it.
Ah,
Yeah. I'm surprised. I thought a lot of people would know that.
Farmers
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
weavers.
All right. Okay, so the family structure, monogamous, exogamous,
What does that
and
mean?
matrilineal. Big words. Monogamous, we know. These were not polygamous marriages, as in many tribes did allow for men to have more than one wife. With the Hopi, it's monogamous, only one man and one woman. Exogamous means that the various clans, if you were in a particular clan, you cannot marry somebody in your clan. You have to marry somebody from a different clan. So that's exogamous. Matrilineal means, like in some other Native American tribes, like the Cherokee, when a man and a woman marry, the man goes to the woman's family. You trace your line of ancestry through the wife, the mother, not through the man. And I've often wondered why that is in sometimes very masculine tribes that may not consider women as equals to them in any sense, yet they still would have a matrilineal lineage. And I actually have not heard a very good explanation for that.
Yeah.
So, yes?
What were the clan boundaries? For example, would a village be one clan or five? Or
So the thing about this is the clans could intermix in the towns, and that became kind of an issue, and near the end I'll explain. It became kind of a problem for the United States government when they were trying to organize the Hopis, the way they expected them to organize, that became an issue. Yeah, clans could be in the same town. That was not a separation. There's no separation there. Here's another interesting thing. The chief's sister's son would follow in his footsteps, not his own son.
Huh.
So, yeah. And there's another curious one. Why in the world would they do that? But somewhere way back in time, they felt that it's not the chief's son who should succeed him. His sister's son would do that. And here's another really good one. The Hopi Indians, and as I said, the reason I wanted to learn about them is because they had a philosophy of peaceful coexistence. They did not want to dominate the tribes around them. They wanted to live in peace with everybody. And so far, this is the only tribe that I've come across that would spank their children. Every other tribe, it's noted by many white people who are among them that they would never spank their children. They would lecture them, they would ostracize them, but they never spanked their kids. The Hopis spank their kids. And yet they are the peaceful tribe. And this is something I came across online, and I haven't read this in any of the books that I had. But so this hairdo of the young girls, the Hopi girls, this was something that they were supposed to have. They have this hairdo before they are married. Once they are married, then they take their hair down. So. What's that?
Is that what they call a squash blossom style?
Oh, I haven't heard that.
Yeah.
Say that again, squash blossom?
Blossom style.
Squash blossom style. That I have not heard. So.
Seems to fit.
So in their religion, as in any other Native American tribe that I've heard, it's polytheistic. There are many gods that they worship, spirits and assorted deities, and of course they have their great spirit. For the Hopis, the sun was their chief god that they would pray to and have festivals for. But then, of course, you have the moon and the stars, and for all occasions, there is a god or spirit that would control the weather, whether you get rain or not, snow, lightning and thunder. So pretty much animistic religion like virtually any Native American tribe. And it was the snake gods that they believed controlled the waters. And when they would see the snakes, and I suppose this is because their water holes or their springs is where they would often see the snakes. And so I guess from there they would assume that it's the snake that controls the water. And so they would have the snake dance, the snake festival, in which they go out and they catch a whole bunch of snakes, including rattlesnakes, and they have this celebration in which they are basically asking the snake gods to bring rain for them. There's Masa'u, the god of fire and death, that protects the Hopis. An interesting deity, this one. He's a very scary god, but he's also the one that protects them at night. He patrols the area, protecting the Hopis. But he's not someone you want to mess with either. He's rather frightening. And sometimes, in some of what I've read, this is seen as their chief god, that they look to more than any other. And the thing about religion among any Native American tribes, since we know that nothing is written down, it's all oral traditions in their religion, it can vary from place to place and from person to person, because there's no scriptures that they can say, no, this is the way this God acts because here's the chapter and verse. A lot of times it's their personal experiences and what they happen to believe that will determine what their God is like. So there's general ideas and general beliefs about their gods, but from clan to clan or even person to person, there's a lot of details that can vary widely because, like I said, there is no Bible, there is no scripture, there's no Quran. It's all word of mouth. So the Kachinas, and this particular spelling I took from the books that I was reading. It's spelled various ways, sometimes with a CH, but in any case, it's Kachinas. The Hopis are well known for their Kachina dolls that I'm sure you can buy at the stores around in Arizona. But the Kachinas were very important to them as spirits. And we'll get into Dawn's experiences as a child, which are pretty fascinating. But they serve many purposes. So it's basically, there's many different types of Kachinas for different purposes. For children, they are kind of like the Santa Claus of the Hopi. They come and you have a dance, you have a festival, and the Kachinas come out and they give gifts, and the children all love them because they are real, and the parents teach their kids this, like many of us teach our kids about Santa Claus. He's coming on Christmas. Well, the Kachinas came about 6 months out of the year, from January to July. There's various festivals, and sometimes people will just throw parties. We're going to celebrate something, and so we're going to all get together and get these guys to dress up in their Kachina outfits and give presents to the children. And so that was what the Kachinas were used for. They also would bring luck. One of the interesting things, one of the things that the Hopis would do on many occasions for many different religious reasons, they would have ground corn that they would toss. And when the Kachinas showed up, you toss ground corn at them as some sort of symbol of life or good luck or something like that. And but there were also Kachinas who were the disciplinarians. And this was, I didn't have the name on here. I forget, there's a particular Kachina that was the scary one. And he would have a long snout like a wolf, and his head would be black. And he would carry with him either a rope or maybe a knife, and he would go, and the parents, this is all connived with the parents, would tell them, I want you to come talk to my little kid who is being a bad kid. And so the Kachina would dress up and maybe bring a rope and come up to the little child and said, you're coming with me, you've been a bad boy, and I'm going to rope you, I'm going to take you back, and I'm going to eat you. And the child, of course, is frightened out of his wits. He's probably only 6 or 7 years old, and runs to his mom and dad, please don't let him take me. And of course the parents say, no, please don't take our little child, he'll be good. And the Kachina would say, no, he's been a bad boy, I know it. And I'm going to take him home and eat him. And so the parents would have to have a piece of meat, raw meat, and say, no, here, we'll offer this to you instead. So take the meat. And of course at first he has to say, no, I'm not taking that, I'm taking your little boy. And so they'd have this back and forth for a little bit until finally the Kachina gives in, okay, but I will be back, and you better be good, otherwise I am going to take you and eat you. And of course, that's how another way that they would just scare the heck out of their children to get them to behave. There were also clown Kachinas. These clown Kachinas were given license to do things that most people were not allowed to do publicly. And I'm talking, of course, in sexual things. And sometimes they would be very scantily clad. And by the way, Kachinas were always men. There were women Kachinas, but they were men dressed as women Kachinas. It was always the men who played these parts. So the clown Kachinas would tell dirty jokes to people. They would say things like, say one Kachina who's practically nude is running around, and another Kachina said, "What are you doing?" And he would say, "I'm chasing my penis. I run, as much as I run, it's always a little bit in front of me." And so those are the kind of dirty jokes that they could say in public. There's other times where they would, there's this other one I read about where these two Kachinas were having, it wasn't a card game, but it was some sort of betting game. And in this game, when you lost the bet, you took off an article of clothing. So it's kind of like strip poker or something like that. And then near the end of this, the one Kachina is practically naked, and the other one grabs him or her to have intercourse there right in front of everybody. And sometimes a clown Kachina may go up to a woman of the audience and pretend like he's going to have sex with her. And this is the kind of thing that was okay, and everybody understood it. So, yes?
So at what age did the kids find out that Santa Claus is not real?
So it's usually, they would have 4 particular kids who were turning like, I don't know, somewhere between 10 and 12. They would have a particular ceremony for these kids, and they would do the whole Kachina thing, and then they would take them aside, and then the Kachinas would take off their masks. And of course the kids would recognize, that's my uncle, that's, people that I know, because you know everybody. So, this autobiography of Don's, he talks about that, and what a great disappointment it was that he could see, this was his uncle or his grandfather or somebody, people that he knew had fooled him all these years. Of course, he became a Kachina dancer himself later on. But
did they still get gifts after they knew?
no. Once you know, then it's the little kids who get the gifts. Yeah. So here's, I really wanted to find pictures of Kachinas, who were dressed up. Now we think of Kachinas, most of the time, you just think of them as the dolls. But that was not their original intent. They were people dressed up, and they had a real purpose. So whenever you see one, yeah. So here's the one that I really like, the Nataska Kachina. This is the scary one that goes around and scares little children. And here are the clown Kachinas. This is something like that they would usually dress up with the black and white stripes and the horns coming up. And of course, we know the type of houses that they lived in. Pueblo, by the way, something that I only learned, I don't know, not that long ago, Pueblo is not a tribe of Indians. Pueblo is the house or the type of house that Indians in that region lived in. The mud brick homes that could be upwards of 3 stories high with wood beams holding them together, and you get into some rooms by climbing ladders. That is a pueblo. Pueblo is just a house in Spanish. So, I mean, for the longest time, I'm sure you've heard too, you talk about the Pueblo Indians as if that was a tribe. It's not. It is a region in which they live in those types of houses. And there's a number of different tribes that can be called Pueblo Indians. So, yeah, let's see. Oh, and one of the neatest parts of the Pueblos are the Kivas. And this is the room that's supposed to look like it's underground. And that's kind of a spiritual significance too, because they believe that they were created in the earth and brought up, as a number of tribes believe that. So the Kiva is a place for men to gather for their particular religious ceremonies, and sometimes just to get together as men as a group. And they will do their carding and spinning wool and tell their tales, and sometimes have their religious ceremonies there as also. Now, women would have their own Kachinas, or not Kachinas, they have their own Kivas, places for them to gather as well. But in the village, where decisions were made, it was the men more than the women. So this is a pueblo of the Hopis.
Are they cooler inside than?
I'm sure they are. I've heard this, and it's not something that I've experienced myself, but the mud brick homes are very good about keeping it cooler inside than the outside temperature, and then keep you warm in the wintertime when it's cold too. And here is a Kiva. It's always, you step down into it from a ladder like you were going down into the earth. And there are no windows, of course. Now, this is something I was looking forward to also. On my next slide, I have Hopi names. Now, you are, at this point, used to names like Man Killer or Bloody Knife, or any number of really sometimes grotesque names, and sometimes somewhat funny names of other Native American tribes. I want you to notice the difference here. Sundown shining, butterflies hatching, butterfly resting, sun standing up, animals run in green pasture, land covered with beautiful flowers, butterflies setting on flowers, cedar bark. That doesn't sound very pretty, but cedar smells nice, so I'm sure that's what it's referring to. Sun in the sky, green corn, almost done. Not really sure about that one. Being sifted. People with a lot of sand know something of that. Flesh. Again, I'm not really sure where that one was going. Set up good. The one that I found that sounded somewhat negative, burn it all up, became, because he was going to be chief, they changed his name to Many Beautiful Colors.
Oh, nice.
So, yeah, very different, isn't it?
Yes.
I could not find any name that had something to do with violence or killing or anything like that. Chuka is Dawn's Indian name, or Hopi name, and Chuka means mud. Now, to us, that sounds like a pretty negative thing. Who would name their child Mud? To the Hopis, mud was a good thing because it meant water. It meant growing crops. So, very, very different idea to the Hopi Indians than to us. Now we get to the invasion of the Europeans. The Spanish came, Francisco Coronado, 1540 to 1542, and he wasn't just to the Hopi Indians, he was also stayed among the Navajos and was among the Apaches, and it was not a good experience for the natives. He stayed for about 2 years and traumatized them, as most Spanish did in those days. But he only stayed for 2 years, which is fortunate for them. But since then, in the years following, there were a number of encounters where the Spanish, it took some time because that is a pretty rough desert to get to. It's not an easy trek from Mexico City all the way up into Arizona and New Mexico. But eventually, they did create settlements there. They built churches, or at least forced the Hopis and other native tribes to build them churches. They got to the Hopis in 1629 and tried their best to subjugate them, as they did all of the Native American tribes, and to convert them from their heathen religious festivals and their heathen beliefs to become good Catholics. They did not succeed very well. There were a number of converts who became Catholic, many of them simply under pressure rather than from their heart. But the point is that the Hopis were dominated, like the other tribes, the Navajos and some of the Apache villages up in Arizona and New Mexico. Of course, they also brought smallpox with them, and that did much damage, killing probably around half of the natives. So there's Coronado and the people of the Pueblo. But there was a success story of a sort. The Hopis, the Navajos, and the other tribes around, after a number of years of this treatment brutalizing them, they revolted. And this is a rather famous Pueblo Revolt of 1680, one of the few successful revolts of Native Americans against Europeans. It was a well-coordinated revolt, and here's another irony. The religion that, and by the way, the Hopi and Navajos as well, their political structure was all religiously based. It was a theocracy. When the Spanish came and imposed Catholicism on them, that was something of a theocracy as well. And so, with some irony, the leader of this revolt was a guy whose name was spelled P-O-P-E. Now, it's not pronounced Pope, it's Pope. So I had to spell it first to get the impact. But yeah, so there's an interesting irony there that the guy who led the revolt against the Catholics was a guy who looks like his name is Pope. And it was a brutal uprising. They killed many Spanish. The lucky ones escaped back to New Mexico. But they got rid of them. So here's the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, and one of the few instances in which the Hopis were violent. They were defending their villages, and they had had enough, so they did kill many Spanish in this revolt. But the Spanish were not going to give up. They tried a number of times to come back, and they did come back and subjugate many of the Navajos and some Apaches in the years following. The Hopi were fortunate in their particular instance because they were more remote than the Navajo, and they had these mesas that they were going to move to. So they moved to the top of these mesas, and as you can see, this would not be a very easy thing to storm these mesas when you have Hopis throwing rocks down on you. So the Spanish never did come back and conquer the Hopis again. What they did do, however, there were some priests who convinced one of the Hopi villages to allow them to build a church in their village. This was something that the other Hopi villages were very angry about. We do not want the Spanish back in our lives. They are going to enslave us again. And so the other Hopi villages got together and planned their attack to destroy that village. Another instance, probably one of the more shameful acts that the Hopis, with their pacifist beliefs, indulged in, they were not going to allow this village to have any Catholics, any missionaries, any priests there, and so they destroyed the village and they killed all of the men. They killed some of the women and children, but the women and children could be taken into other villages, so that was allowed. But they killed all of the Spanish who were there, and that town was just destroyed and not occupied again. Over the years, the Spanish didn't give up entirely. They tried a number of times to come back, but the Hopis were very fortunate in their geography. They were a long ways away. It was a very difficult journey, and you had to get through some rampaging Navajo tribes and Apaches to get there. And so the Navajos and the Apaches were actually helpful to the Hopis. The Hopis, by the way, were often picked on, raided by the Navajos and Apaches because they were pacifist, and they knew that they could attack almost at will, not quite, because the Hopis did defend themselves usually fairly well, and once they were on the mesas, they were a lot more difficult to get anyway. But the Navajos were a problem for the Hopis over the years. But then the United States takes over. Mexico, when it declared independence from Spain in 1821, really had almost nothing to do with the Hopis in their short history of being under Mexican rule. They were just too far away and too insignificant for the Mexican government to really bother with. Mexican government had enough to do just keeping itself together, let alone trying to reach out to a small tribe of Indians way out there. So the United States took control after the Mexican-American War, 1848, and in 1851, the U.S. sent representatives out to the Hopis to basically get to know them and let them know, by the way, you are now part of the United States. Not that it mattered much to them, they just wanted to be left alone. But what they did do was ask for help with regard to the Navajos and the Apaches, who were still raiding their territories. Now that the Spanish were gone, the one good thing that the Spanish left were the sheep and the goats and the horses, and they also left peach trees and apricots.
Wow.
And so they could grow them. They now had orchards of peaches and apricots, which they valued very highly as well. So when the Navajos came and raided, or the Apaches, these are the types of things that they would steal. The sheep, the goats, the horses. And so this is what the Hopis were asking from the American government. Please protect us from the Navajos. So the U.S. built Fort Defiance, which later became Fort Canby, in 1851. And then later on, the Navajo Apache Wars, they subdued their tribes fairly brutally, as the United States always did. Really not so much to help out the Hopis as to make them settle down, the Navajos and the Apaches, so that they wouldn't attack white settlements. And of course, waves of smallpox would come and go, really decimating the tribes, all the tribes. And so from a probably peak population of somewhere around maybe 15,000, they're now down to about 2,000. And of course, in the late 1800s is when the American missionaries would come out, and they started with the Mormons. Supposedly the Hopis kind of liked at least the manners of the Mormons. They did not like the polygamy. The Hopis did not believe in polygamy, and the Mormons at this time did. They liked the Mennonites because they were pacifists, but all in all, there were not a lot of converts at first. The first several years, the missionaries did not have a lot of success with the Hopis. So there's Fort Defiance, later Fort Canby. And as with all Native American tribes, they had issues with the white settlers coming in and taking up their lands. The Hopis were probably fortunate, a lot more fortunate than most tribes, because their land was so desolate that there were not nearly as many people coming out there to settle there. And of course, it's very fortunate that nobody found gold out there either. That would have really did them in. But for the most part, they lost some land to white settlement, but not nearly as much as most other tribes did. And then in 1882, Chester A. Arthur signed the bill that created the Hopi Reservation. And there is a particular square in Arizona, and it's kind of shown on the map that I gave you. I wish it could have been larger. I'll show you in a minute the territories, but unfortunately for the Hopis, in the bill, it stated that this land would be for the Hopis and other Indians. Now, what I believe he had intended, or the Congress people who made this bill intended, the fact is the Hopis in their villages had other tribes with them. And these are very small tribes mostly, but there was the Kiowa Indians who were there that had a village in the Hopi area with the other Hopi villages. They were there. A lot of that was because they were protecting the Hopis. Hopis invited them up because they were better soldiers. They were better warriors, and they protected them somewhat from the invasions and the raids from the Navajos and Apaches. But the point is that the Hopis were not alone in that area. And so there were the Hopis, the Kiowas, and a few other small tribes that I think were intended to be a part of that reservation. the Navajos took that to mean, well, we're Indians too. We can take that land. The Navajos, being a much larger tribe, was a real problem for the Hopis, and they started taking more and more land from them. And it was mainly grazing land for their sheep and goats and horses and cattle. So, the schooling issue. When I think of this, the history of the Hopis, I think of all the Native American tribes, the Hopis, more than any others, could have just been left alone and did not need intervention from the American government. And it's one of the many tragedies, of course, that the U.S. government felt the need to improve the lives of the Hopis in ways that they didn't need improving. Now, schooling is a good thing. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have had schools, but I do not believe in forced schooling for a tribe that doesn't want it. They put schools in there. 1874, they started the first school, and at first it was voluntary. Voluntary is a good thing. So children of parents who wanted their children to get a white education, learn to read and write, speak English, that was a good thing for them. But it was not voluntary for long. In the 1880s, it was made mandatory. And if you did not send your child to school, you could be arrested. And this is what happened. And soldiers would come to gather up the children to take them to school. And this was boarding school, not a local school. At first there was a local school, but they wanted to get the children away from the parents. They wanted to in a sense, they wanted to exterminate the culture. So they were to be raised as white kids. So they took the kids by force, the ones who wouldn't go willingly. There were, and we'll talk about this in a second, there was a division among the Hopis between what was called the friendlies and the hostiles. And the friendlies were okay with going to school, going to boarding school, wearing white kids' clothes, and learning to speak English, all of that. There was the hostiles who were not okay with that. And so there were a number of fathers who were sent to Alcatraz, of all places. The peaceful, non-violent Hopis sent to the Alcatraz, one of the most, what do you say? One of the most secure, notorious prison for violent offenders, and the Hopis are sent there for a little less than a year because of their grave offense at not wanting their kids to be forced into a school they don't like.
One of those looks like a woman.
I know, some of them look very young too, to me. But these are the elders. These are fathers who did not want their children to go to school. So, as I said, the intent of the schooling is to teach them English, to read and write, and to replace the Hopi culture with white Protestant culture. They were taught Christianity as well. I'm not sure what denomination was teaching it. I doubt that it was Catholic back in those days. Some Protestant religion was in charge of their schooling. And so the friendlies versus the hostiles. This became a very important issue in the Hopi villages. And in one famous incident in Oraibi, that it wasn't quite half and half, but it became such a split They even had different Kivas, where the friendlies would have their Kiva and the hostiles would have theirs, because they were no longer on speaking terms. They really detested each other. Now, it was going to become violent, and the Hopis, to their credit, decided, no, we're not violent people, especially against ourselves. So we're going to have a pushing contest. And so they gathered in the village, and they drew a line, and the men of the village got together to push one side past that one line, or the other side was to push past the others. This was in 1909, I believe. So the friendlies won. They pushed the hostiles past the line, and so the hostiles had to leave. And they left and created their own village a few miles away. The tribal government, this is another one that was just kind of, you think of government bureaucracies trying to create a government for somebody else, and this is kind of what you get. In the United States government, we are used to having village, town, city governments running that particular town, and so obviously this is what we need to impose on the Hopis. As I said earlier, we were talking about the different clans. The Hopis were run by their clans. The clans could be in various villages. They were not bound by any particular territory. And that was okay with them. But their village government, their Hopi government, was run by clan, not by someone from a village. But the United States government said, we are going to give them representative government, just like we have it. And so we're going to tell them that their governments are going to be centered on their villages. And their village will elect someone to run that village, and a town council and all of that. Well, they came up with this plan, and they had a vote. They said, we are going to allow the Hopis to vote on this. If they don't like it, then we understand, we'll work with them. Well, the Hopis didn't want to vote, the ones who didn't like this idea, so the only ones mostly who voted were the ones who liked the idea. So guess what? The idea passed because overwhelmingly, from the US government point of view, look at this. They really like this idea. All of these votes in favor. They just didn't realize or didn't want to realize that the ones who didn't like the idea weren't going to vote. And so this government was imposed for purposes of representing the Hopis for our government. It was imposed upon them and seen by many Hopis as completely illegitimate. Now, coming to this autobiography, and as I say, if you ever come across this, this is really a great read. He's very frank about a lot of things that if I was writing my autobiography, I would not. I would not write about certain things. So anyway, so here are some of the beliefs about the birth experience. He writes about his birth experience. I'm sure his mother told him about it, and he was told all of the legends and myths and beliefs about Hopi life. So, when he was in the womb, he was twins, and his mother said, I don't want twins, I just want one, to the local medicine man, and he said, okay, I'll take care of that. So he got two pieces of yarn, one black and one white, and he twisted them together and tied it around her left wrist, and that will take care of that problem. That will twist them into one child. So that's what happened. And it's interesting, he writes about things and he went through a white education as he grew up. And you kind of wonder how much of this he actually believes and how much he does not. He seems to believe what he writes about, mostly. So, the taboos, if you are a pregnant mother, you cannot hold another woman's child in your lap. That will distress the fetus inside, as if he's being replaced. You cannot breathe on another child. I'm not really sure what bad things will happen if you do, but it's a bad thing. If you are sitting down, you should turn to the side so that people don't walk right in front of you. That will distress the child also. If you want an easy birth experience, you get a weasel and you eat the raw meat of this weasel, and you take the skin of the weasel and you rub it on your belly. As we know, weasels are very quick, and that quickness will help you have a quick delivery. Mothers give birth on their hands and knees with the medicine man and others around rubbing the body and helping the passage that way. When the placenta comes out, you need to take it outside of town, and there is a place right outside of town where you put placentas. The reason that you do that is because if somebody steps on a placenta, bad things will happen to you. Your feet will get chapped. Your urine will turn thick. And what was it? There's another one. Anyway, there's something else bad that would happen to a person who stepped on a placenta. So there's a particular place, and everybody knew this is the place where the placentas go. You just don't walk over that. They're really into juniper tea, juniper leaves. That was a soothing drink to them, and kind of a sacred tree that would do wonderful things for people. And there's a number of medicinal uses that they use juniper for. And, one thing I left out, while the woman is pregnant, during the pregnancy, you want to have intercourse with the father as often as you can, because that is like watering the plant. It helps him grow. But after the baby is born, no intercourse for 40 days, because you don't want to have a child soon after your child that was born, because then you'll have two breastfeeding babies, and you breastfeed for about 2 years, by the way. So you don't want two breastfeeding babies, so you go at least 40 days without intercourse after the baby's born. So, as I'm sure you've seen, young Native American babies wrapped up very tightly in these blankets, and they have their cradles that they are wrapped to so that the mother can carry the baby on her back. They're cleaned 3 or 4 times a day, and you take the saliva of the baby and put it on his own neck. That's to protect it from evil spirits. Somehow that hides the baby or keeps the baby from being known to evil spirits. And the dried navel cord, when that falls off of the navel, you attach it to an arrowhead, and you attach that to a beam on the ceiling of your home. That way, the child is more likely to be a good hunter when he grows up. And also, if the child happens to die in infancy, the spirit of the child will be there up in the ceiling and can enter into the woman again the next time she's pregnant, so that this child can be born again. So there's a little Native American baby. I tried to find a picture that said a Hopi baby, but this is a Navajo, so it's kind of close in the area anyway. But this would be a similar type that would be wrapped up. I've heard, and I don't know how accurate this is, but I've heard that it really does not harm a baby to be wrapped up tightly for long periods of time, for months on end. That they grow and develop just the same anyway, as long as it's not like 3 or 4 years, but the first several months of a baby being wrapped tightly is perfectly okay for their health. Again, that's just something I'd heard. I don't know how authoritative it is. So as most Native American tribes, the young children run naked for the most part, almost until puberty. You could be 10 or 12 and run naked through your town or village, and that's perfectly acceptable. When Don talks about himself running naked through the village, they would always tell him, whenever the missionaries show up, you have to come put clothes on, because white people are very uncomfortable with children running naked. Another thing that will strike you as rather maybe bizarre is the freedom that they have with their sexuality, and sometimes rather inappropriately. So he remembers as a young child that there were always sexual jokes towards young children. And so women that he would identify as his aunts, and there's going to be a lot of aunts, but they would say things to him like, I want your penis, and they would grab him.
Nice.
And not just him, children in general, young boys, and they would teasingly say how much they wanted it. And he remembers as a young child not really knowing that this was teasing. And then to make it worse, when he would be out playing with his friends and he sees some of his uncles would look at him and say, "You made love to my wife. You're after my wife. I know you are. I'm going to castrate you."
Nice.
And he says there was one in particular who he was watching as this uncle, or it might have been some grandfather, I forget who exactly it was. But this man was in the process of castrating sheep and goats. And so when he was watching his uncle do this particularly, probably a very mean-spirited guy, even by that standards, this was beyond what was normal. But he grabbed him, tied him hand and foot, and put the knife up to his scrotum, and with the dull part was sawing on him, saying, "I am going to castrate you because you made love to my wife." And just terrorized him, and he's only like 8 years old. So, of course, the whole gag was meant, well, I don't know how it was meant, but the way it would go is the women would tease in a friendly way, the men would tease in a mean way, and the women would defend and chide their husbands, saying, "You leave him alone, don't do that, that's mean." So that was kind of the way it would work. He did say, however, when he grew up that he got the guy back. He roped him and dragged him down some hill. And I forget what the circumstance was, but he did get him back. So The whole Kachina thing I talked about already. He loved whenever they would have the Kachina dances and get the presents. And he never said that he was ever approached by one of the mean Kachinas and said that he was going to be dragged off and eaten. But he did know that that type of thing happened. And he believed, as a young child, that they did sometimes drag these kids off and eat them. He really believed that. So, he was from a family of the friendlies, and he said he actually looked forward to going to school. His first year of school, he went to a local school that he could walk to. He said that he saw the military come and take kids to school. And by the way, it was the African American troops that did this. And why that was, I don't know. But he remembers, this is the only place that I've read this, by the way. I've read in a number of places that they used the military to come in and take the kids to school. In his autobiography, he said that this was the Negro troops that came and did this. So anyway, so his first year was local. After that, he went to a boarding school some miles away. His experiences, he seemed to think he enjoyed it for the most part. His first year, he said, was rather boring. He didn't think he learned a lot. But afterwards, as the years progressed, he rather enjoyed school. And he said that the teachers mostly were very kind to him, which is kind of nice to hear. I've heard otherwise from other sources. But and then for high school, he went to Riverside, California. They shipped him way over to California, and then they would come back, by the way. The boarding school was only through the school year. They did come back for the summers. And yeah, like I said, he mostly enjoyed his experiences. He was spanked a number of times or whipped by the disciplinarians in school, but that's something that would be common in any school at that time. And he talks about his first sexual encounters. When he was about 7 or 8, he remembers a woman who was about 20 who took him to her room and wanted to have intercourse with him. It frightened him terribly, especially since she was on her period and he saw the blood on his penis. And he was scared out of his wits. She told him, please don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody that this happened. Of course, he runs off and tells his parents right off. And he said that his parents talked with her, and that kind of thing never happened again. But she was still nice to him after that. He was told by one of his elders that girls, at your age, girls are kind of dangerous, and you should start with something like a chicken, or a dog, or a sheep. And so he, with a friend of his, took a chicken to have their first encounter sexually. And afterwards they plucked it and killed it, ate it. So his first encounter with a young girl, he was 12 and she was 13. They went to a rather large chicken coop to have some privacy. And it was, he said, it was the girl who was the initiator. And he thought initially that this would be her first time as well. But he thought afterwards, and as he's writing this, she knew what to do way too much for her to be a virgin. And then when he went off to school, especially at Riverside, he talks about more sexual encounters. When he was 16, there was a young girl who was rather depressed and said that her parents did not care for her and did not feed her well, and that she was very sad. And so if there was a young man who would feed her and take care of her, she would marry him. And at 16, you know, that sounds like a great thing. You're going to get married and be happy the rest of your life. So, so he said, yes, He actually worked in the kitchen, so he had extra food. And so he said, yes, I will give you food and I will take care of you and we can get married. That lasted a few months before he found another girl who was prettier and fell for her also. Soon forgot about the woman that he was going to marry. Ought to be 16 again, huh? So he grew up, and once he was done with schooling, he really wanted to go back to the Hopi village and be a Hopi again. He did not care to live in the white man's world or to be a Christian, which he was pressured into as well. But he went back to his Hopi ways and became a Kachina performer. He did get married, often cheated on his wife. He talks about that as well. They did not have children that lived, but he adopted a boy as his son from another family. And he was very sad, as many were in his later years, that the old ways are dying, that the young people do not care for the Hopi religion anymore, and the ceremonies were slowly dying out. So, here is a map of Arizona. This is what we believe are the traditional territories of the various tribes, with the Hopi being up here. And the Navajo, you'll notice, only has this corner, and of course up into the other New Mexico as well, the Four Corners region. Here's the Apache. In 1882, I talked about Chester A. Arthur signing this bill. This rectangle here was the land that the Hopis were supposed to get. And but since it said "and other Indians," the Navajos took that to mean we could take this too. And so they started taking more and more land, mainly for grazing. And the Navajos, a much larger tribe, they got away with it. Here's the reservation today. This is the map that I have on your handout. And this area up here is what's left of the Hopi territory.
They buy the Grand Canyon.
So the Grand Canyon is this area here, I believe.
Oh, okay.
So it's kind of on the edge.
Oh.
And there's the Hopi flag. Any questions, comments? Yes?
What's the relationship between the Hopi and the Tohono O'odham? Are they connected?
I do not know. That's not something I'm familiar with. Anything else? Yes?
And on your reading, I have been told that the Native Americans learned the scalping from the Spaniards. They didn't do it prior to that. Do you know if that's true or not?
So I looked that up too, because I had heard that as just kind of a rumor. Somebody said, it was the white people that taught the Indians how to scalp. So I looked that up, and there's actually a very good article in the American Heritage magazine that refutes that. That says that there's archaeological evidence from skulls prior to European contact that shows that, yeah, there were plenty of scalpings before white people came. And it's, like I said, it's a very good article. There's a number of very good evidence, a lot of good evidence that shows, first of all, Europeans, there's no evidence that they ever scalped prior to coming to America. So why that would be a thing when they got here, it's kind of strange too, but yeah. Anything else?
On behalf of the class, I want to thank you for all the work you've done. And I've attended all of your classes, and I've noticed a trend. You started off with high-minded people, Benjamin Franklin, the fathers of our democracy, European leaders, Napoleon, Catherine the Great. Then we saw the burning of Joan of Arc. Now we've seen, except for today, all these nasty Indian tribes that tortured people to death. And I noticed that next semester you're going to teach the biggest killers in history. So I see this downward trend in your sermons all the time. I can't wait to see what you're going to teach in the spring. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We hope you're
Chardonnay.
not a teetotaler.
Huh?
We hope you're not a teetotaler.
Oh, no, I'll drink.
If there's any left, you're right,